Hello and welcome to the introduction lesson for our Plants for Food and Fiber unit. So you will have just finished a brainstorm on a Google Doc as to different uses for plants. If you haven't done that, please close the video and go back and do page 1. For those of you that have done it, you would have likely listed many different foods, fibers, medicines, maybe some aesthetics for looks around the house, different ideas in which we use plants. Okay, and when you really start to think about it, plants are used everywhere. Okay, so some different ways that we use plants are things like food, fruits, and veggies as well. If you think of like olive oil, canola oil, all those things that we cook in, those are all come from plants. Okay, we have clothing, things like cotton. Cotton is a nice soft fabric. It also creates light, flexible clothing, and it whisks sweat away really well and then gives it off to the environment and dries itself. We also have flax for things like making linen and dyes. There's paper, there's building materials, like 90% of the houses in North America and in Canada are made out of wood. Okay, we have medicines over thousands of years. If we think back to our First Nations cultures, they used a lot of the things that came from the land, and a lot of that was plants. And then fuel. So biofuel can be made from corn and other crops, or also people have burned wood as a fuel and to give off heat. So if we look at a fiber is using a part of the plant to essentially build something or to make something, whether it's making energy or a different product, uh, it's not eating it. Okay, so fiber is using a plant for something other than food. Okay, so the fibers are the tissue of the plants that come from the stems, leaves, seeds, or roots. So if we look at this picture here on this slide, this is a picture of cotton. Okay, and if you're wearing a t-shirt, there's a good chance that it's made out of cotton. If you take a look at the tag, it'll tell you what percentage of different materials there was. But cotton is a natural fiber that's been grown and used by humans for centuries, so hundreds of years. So again, like I mentioned earlier, it absorbs moisture and allows it to evaporate easily. Okay, if we take a look at hemp. Now, I want to be clear here, and if we were in class, I'm sure this would break out into a large discussion, but we're not talking about marijuana. Okay, we are talking about hemp. Very similar plants. However, hemp has none of the effects of getting people high. Okay, so hemp is a very, very valuable product, and it also has been used for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's one of the oldest cultivated fiber plants in the world. If you look online, you'll find there's lists of over 1,000 uses for hemp. It's a very, very useful crop. Um, you can recycle it much more times than wood pulp. So paper, after it's been recycled 5 or 6 or 7 times, will start to break down to the point where you can't recycle it any further, and it's no longer usable. Hemp can be recycled much longer. Herbicides and insecticides lots of times aren't needed, and it can be used to make paper, clothing, shoes. It's used to make hemp rope, which is very strong. Okay. And if you take a look at this picture, so if we start on the left-hand side here, we can see that we have flax seeds, and then from that, it grows kind of a straw, and then it's broken down, and eventually you get this linen fabric once it's all made. So this is just kind of a quick overview of the progression of flax to linen. If you look at cotton to t-shirts, I've posted a video in the Google Doc. Okay, and again, the cotton on the tree looks very different than the cotton t-shirt does, and that means that it's processed. Okay, or we've taken it and we've done things with it. So we see this a lot when we use plants for fiber. For example, wood. When you're building something like a deck or a fence, lots of time people will get something called pressure treated wood. Here it's processed to last longer and to be more resistant to water and to insects. So as our technologies get better, we are processing our plants more and more before we use them for fiber. So plants are a critical part of the ecosystem as well. They provide shelter for animals. Okay, tons of birds, monkeys, insects all call trees their home. Okay, and without those, they wouldn't survive. They also clean, filter, and regulate water from places. They use a lot of the water from the ground, but they also put a lot of it back out into the atmosphere. And we're going to talk about that more when we talk about the actual process of photosynthesis next day. They also prevent soil erosion. Okay, and this is why the majority of us have grass in our yard. And if maybe your parents have built a new house or you've been out to Southridge to some of the new areas where people haven't quite laid grass down yet, when it gets windy, you notice that there's dirt blowing around everywhere, and your vehicle is now dusty, and everything else around there is also kind of dusty. So that's called soil erosion when soil moves from one place to another by either the wind or the water. So when we have plants, they actually do a really good job of holding on to soil. Okay, so imagine if you took a leaf blower out into your backyard and you were blowing all the leaves, or even when you're raking, at the end you don't also have a big pile of soil. You'd have a pile of leaves, but you'd notice that all the soil stayed where it was, and that's because the roots of the grass actually hold on to that. So nearly 75% of the world's food supply is based on seven major crops. Okay, so that's wheat, rice, corn, potatoes, barley, cassava, and sorghum. Okay, those are our main crops. So 75% of the world's food supply. Okay, I want you to think for a second why certain countries might rely heavily on plants as opposed to animals for food. I know animals take up a lot of space, and animals are very expensive to raise. So, in a lot of countries that maybe don't quite have the economic status of like Canada or the United States, and I mean, we eat a lot of vegetables too, so not taking that out of the equation, but in a lot of countries, it comes down to there isn't the space to be raising animals, there isn't the money to be raising animals, and a lot of their diet ends up coming from vegetables. And you can have a vegetarian diet and still receive all the nutrients that you need. So it's very doable. So corn is something that is used huge. And if you take a look at this old school poster here, it says wholesome, nutritious foods from corn. Now, we've come a long way from here, and we know that just because it comes from a plant doesn't mean that it stays healthy. Okay, for example, things with cornstarch and corn syrup. We're taking a look at cakes, candies, puddings, toppings for salads, shortening, which is essentially kind of like a fat alternative, you can think of it as, used to like fry things in. Now, back in the day, they were like, this comes from corn, it's really healthy. But we now know that that isn't always the case. And plants and vegetables, or vegetables and fruits, actually have a lot of sugar in them, and albeit healthy sugar, if you're overeating them, it still is not necessarily great for your body. So flax, which we kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, and you took a look at the flax to linen progression. So it's 2 or 3 times as strong as cotton. Okay, now it's not as soft as cotton. So when you're making clothing, it's like or different materials, you kind of have to pick now. Are we really worried about it being soft? Are we really worried about it being lightweight? Are we really worried about it being very strong? And you kind of pick the material. It's generally difficult to have the best of all of the worlds. Okay, so uh, flax is also used in things like oil paints and varnishes. So plants are medicine, as I had mentioned before. This is widely used by a lot of people. There's more than 7,000 medicines that are made from plants. Okay, if you take a look at the opium poppy, so poppies, they can provide something that's called morphine. So it's a very strong painkiller. It's not something that they would give you for like a headache or excuse me, or if you bump your elbow, but something like if you break your leg, you might receive a small dose of morphine. It is quite addictive, so it's something that they really monitor, and they don't like to use too much if they don't have to. But it is a very strong painkiller, and also codeine, which is a cough suppressant. And scientists often use chemicals found in trees as a starting point for producing new medications. So there are tons and tons and tons of medications that we wouldn't have if we didn't have plants. Plants for transportation. Now, um, if we again kind of look back to early settlers' times, First Nations times, we know that they built a lot of the things that they traveled on the river with out of trees. Okay, so things like canoes would have been built out of wood. Now, another way of using a tree is from the natural rubber. And you can look up videos of this, but rubber actually comes out of a tree, much like maple syrup does. There is now kind of synthetic rubber that's being produced, but back in the day, rubber was used to make things like balls or tires for people. So I had mentioned this before. 90% of all houses in North America are made of wood, And we have massive forests in British Columbia that provide a large population of the timber that's used around the world. So that's actually one of Canada's main trading resources is our wood industry. Okay, so there has to be a lot of regulations with this. I don't know if you remember, but we talked about sustainability earlier in the year. And if you're constantly just cutting down trees and sending them to other countries and you're not replanting them and giving them a chance to grow, eventually your industry is going to run out. So we need to make sure that when we're using these things and we're trading with other countries, that we're doing so in a sustainable fashion. We can't be giving away more than we have or more than we can produce. So plants for fuel. So wood is still used in some parts of the world as fuel, or even if you're camping. I mean, you light up a fire and you roast some hot dogs or some marshmallows. Maybe you cook a steak over the fire. You were using wood as your cooking fuel that day. Dead plant matter, and we've talked about this a little bit earlier in the year, and also dead animal matter under high pressure and high heat can turn into coal. Some of the original trains were powered off of coal by burning coal is how they received their energy. Okay, and plants can also be used to make ethanol for fuel. Um, and this is something that in the States you can see it, and it's called E85. I went on a road trip one time to St. Louis, and on our way there was just cornfields everywhere. And the cornfields weren't actually being produced so that people could eat the corn. They were being used to go through a process called fermentation, and then it would create ethanol. And ethanol can actually be burned in a vehicle as a replacement to gasoline and power a vehicle that way. So that's called ethanol or E85. It's a lot larger in the States as it is up here. It's difficult to find, especially in Medicine Hat. So plants are a critical part of the ecosystem. Okay, so we've talked about this one before, and you would have learned this in elementary school, but plants produce oxygen. Okay, without plants, we all would be dead. We need to breathe oxygen in all the time, and if we don't have plants producing oxygen, there's really nowhere else for us to get it. Our bodies give off carbon dioxide, and plants absorb that carbon dioxide. They go through the process of photosynthesis, and they give away oxygen. Okay, now this is something that most people don't know, so I'm going to let you into a little piece of information here, but plants also use oxygen. Okay, most people think that humans breathe in oxygen, give out carbon dioxide, plants breathe in carbon dioxide, give away oxygen, which they do, but they also breathe in oxygen, and we're going to talk about that more tomorrow when we talk about photosynthesis in a little bit more detail. So although they do provide us with oxygen, they also need that oxygen. All living things need oxygen to survive. Photosynthesis. So in terms of, there's some ingredients that go into this. Okay, so for a plant to do photosynthesis, it needs to absorb carbon dioxide. It needs to have water, and the water it gets from its roots. Okay, that is how a plant brings water into it. It doesn't do it through the leaves, it doesn't do it through the stem. So if you're out watering the trees in your yard, or you're watering any of the plants, spraying water on the leaves isn't helping your plant. Okay, the water needs to go into the ground so it can come up the roots. And then as well, it needs light. And our plants that grow outside get the light from the sun. Okay, if you're growing it inside, depending where you're growing it, there's a chance that maybe you have like a heat lamp or some sort of lamp on it, or maybe it's just sitting by a window, in which case it would still just be using the sun. Okay, so think about this as like a plant doing its own baking. It's making its own food. It's cooking in the kitchen. So it takes some carbon dioxide, takes some water, takes the energy from the light, smushes it all together, and what it produces is sugar. And that's what the plant is going to use. The plant's going to use that sugar as its energy source. And then it also produces oxygen. And that oxygen it's just going to give away. Okay, that's just kind of the extra thing that it makes. And it's like, I don't know that I really need this at the moment. And it gives it away. Okay, so don't confuse that statement with plants needing oxygen. So plants do need oxygen, but the oxygen from photosynthesis is given away, and later it'll pull in oxygen from the air around it. So plant needs versus human wants and needs. So we do rely on plants heavily. Okay, the more you start to think about it, the more you see all the things that plants make. Okay, and I would even suggest going onto Google and just looking, things that are made from plants, and just look at the long list. Or next time you're in the grocery store, take a look around and see all the different things that are made from plants. Okay, so we need to determine how we can establish a healthy balance between the needs of plants and our wants and needs. Obviously, like I said, if we go out and we cut down all the forests and we don't replant anything, you could build with all the wood you have, but once it runs out, it's gone. Okay, until you wait for the new trees to be replanted and to regrow. So it's really important for us to live in a sustainable fashion, to make sure that if we're taking resources from the earth around us, that we're putting them back, or that we're only taking them as fast as they can replace themselves, or else at some point we're going to run out. So that's the end of today's notes. Okay, there's multiple other things that you're going to be doing in the Google Doc, so continue following through. You're going to be doing some reading on different root systems as well, so tap roots and fibrous roots. And I would really encourage you, as we go through this unit, to go outside and take a look around. Look at the trees, look at the flowers, look for the things that we talk about. Okay, we don't we don't learn this material just to have it sitting up in our head and not do anything. We do it so we can understand the world around us. So I really, really encourage you to get out there, and if you have a dandelion growing in your yard, take it, pick it out carefully, and look what type of root system it has. Look what types of adaptations it has. What makes a dandelion survive? Ask yourself, how does a dandelion reproduce? These are all things that we're going to learn through this unit, and I want you to apply them to the world around you. So make sure during this unit you're getting outside and you're taking a look around. So that's everything for now. Make sure you let me know if you have any questions. Send me a private comment on Google Classroom, or you can email me. Have an excellent day, everyone.